Hi everybody, let's get started. Before we do, I just want to say one more time the way the grading works in this course, because I've had a number of inquiries. I've met with a bunch of students already. Anybody who wants to meet with me on their midterm, I welcome you to do so. Just send me an email and we'll set up a time. This is the histogram for the course as a whole, which is online. For the midterm, the mean was 78.9. Think of it as 79, right about there, which is really pretty good. Okay, so I was pleased by the class's performance. At a course like this, the way it works is that I'm a numbers guy, and I don't even know what letter grades mean, especially not anymore. And so what we do is we put the whole course on a 100-point scale at the end. Add up all the things, prorated. Based on the fraction that we told you how much they're worth. This is worth 20%. And then you end up with 100, some number of points out of 100 for everything in the course at the end. And then we look at the separate histograms from the different sections, because there are actually 6 different courses here. And those means are all different. And that's because the material is different. I assume that there's enough people so that they shouldn't be very different. And so then we change the scale within each precept so that the means are all the same, okay? And so there's a standard way to do this mathematically. I also formally subtract off the mean and divide by the standard deviation within a course, which makes the same statistical shape for every distribution, all right, from each section. And then I put them all back together again, and then have a grand distribution. And from that, I draw lines on it that separates A's from A minuses, from B plus, from B's, and so on. Now, this is Princeton, so a large majority of you will get A's and B's in this course, okay? And so how do you read something like this? The first thing you want to remember is that this is worth 20% of your grade. And so the mean is going to be, somewhere between a high B and a low B plus, something like that, okay? That means that if you're 30 points below the mean, down in here, if you multiply that by 0.2, then that's like starting 6 points below the mean on a 100-point scale, okay? At the end of the course, when all is done, right? So 6 points below the mean is a handicap. But if you were to get the mean for the rest of the course, you'd probably end up, you're ending up somewhere about here, which is probably still in the B's, right? So it's not a deep hole, but it is a hole, okay? And so you don't want to be 30 points below the mean on the next one and the one after that, right? So on all the other pieces. So come see me if you're down in this tail, and I'll work with you to keep you from being in that tail, okay? So that's the way this works. And if anybody has any questions about it, let us know. There are keys that are being posted online. They're still missing a couple of questions because of, I'm not sure why, but almost every section has keys that explain the grading. And the rest, I think for some of them it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard maybe to build a key for an English essay. Yeah. Because there's so many, it's sort of an infinite number of possible responses. So are there any questions about any of that? I want to just make sure that everybody sees that, because we keep getting the same questions over and over and over again. Right. All right, good. So now we're going to talk about the current situation in the world with respect to climate change. And this is, we live in sort of interesting times here, I think. So we live at a time of political stalemate, the Green New Deal, and what I'm calling tremors on the right. You'll know all about the Green New Deal. I hope you've read the Green New Deal. We're going to talk about it today. You probably don't know about the tremors on the right, which have been done in a sort of secret and sneaky way, but nonetheless have been done. And I think they indicate the possibility for a phase change in the coming decade or so, or maybe sooner. But it won't happen without anguish, I'm sure. Also, when we're done, I want to continue the discussion of the divestment issue, if you guys will participate. I think that's useful. All right, so the Paris in America thing that Obama's administration signed us up to has a nationally determined contribution that consisted of a thing called, or still consists of a thing called the Clean Power Plan, which reduced emissions by 0.41 gigatons per year by 2030. You should know that we're starting here at about 5.5 gigatons of CO2 emissions in this country. Okay, so this is the Clean Power Plan, if you've heard about that. That reduces emissions by 0.41 of that 5.5 by 2030. And then there's a thing called the Carbon Action Plan, which is bigger. It reduces emissions by 1.02 gigatons per year in 2030. That's mostly the cars and trucks rule and so both of these have been attacked by the Trump administration. This one, both of them are subject to, both of them are in the courts right now, all right? And as you know, on Monday, the Trump administration filed papers to withdraw us from the Paris Agreement internationally, the only nation in the world. And, but it takes a full year to do that, which means it would become effective the day after the next election. But you can rejoin in 30 days, okay? But they're probably going to make you pay to rejoin. I mean, the thing is that, yeah, it's going to, yeah. Anyway, all right, so what does this look like? So here's a diagram that actually came out of the Obama administration when they did this. Here were emissions. They have this in CO2 equivalents, so it's higher than 5.5. It includes methane and all of that, all right? And now the emissions are here. They forecasted emissions to be going up, okay? And that was a little sneaky because our emissions as a country have been going down, okay? And so that's like sneaky stuff that political groups do to make it easier on themselves. Now, these are people who passionately believe that the characters who, we've got this infrastructure project here at Princeton that I'll tell you about later, what the conclusions are from it, how to build a net zero infrastructure in the United States as sort of an engineering project. And the people who designed this are actually on that project, right? They're like, they actually come to the meetings and everything. And so they'll tell you, how all this happened. And basically, this is just, they wanted to make it easier on themselves. I mean, it's that easy, right? And so, if we push this button, our NDC for the Paris Agreement is right there. The long-term goal is right there, which is about 80% less than we currently have, but not net zero. The Clean Power Plan is the little gap between the dashed blue line and the light blue line. And I don't know if there's another click. Yeah. The Carbon Action Plan is the gap between the light blue line and those black dots, okay? So all of that should strike you as pretty small potatoes, right? So there's not big changes there by 2030, all right? But nonetheless, this is supposedly then on a track to go down here. But of course, it's also starting from an inflated view about what the future is likely to be, with US emissions historically having gone down because the majority of new installed electric power is wind and solar right now. And the rest is natural gas. Coal power is retiring all the time. Trump's big donor, who is the coal president by a guy named Murray, who is the reason why there's been so much defense of coal, that's dropped off the radar screen because Murray's company just went bankrupt, okay? And it went bankrupt because coal power is no longer economical relative to gas and renewables. So this number, the top blue line, was actually going to be decreasing anyway. So there's some suspicion that we'll meet this NDC even if both of these things fail to be overturned. Trump's repeal of these things failed to be overturned simply because business as usual is now starting to carry us down. All right. So that's where We were at the end of the Obama administration about 3 years ago, with a 2050 goal that was not net zero, that was at about 80% lower than our emissions peak. And so the elephant in the room has always been in this course Donald Trump. And what I do here is I've got a list of the attempted environmental rollbacks by administrative actions, almost all of them so-called administrative actions that are extra-congressional, all right? They're not in the courts and not in Congress. They're just administrative actions. The New York Times keeps a rolling list of these things if you want to have a look at them. And there's this convenient little table. There have been 85 separate attempts at rolling back Nexus problems regulations, all right? And this is actually only for water, climate, and biodiversity. There are separate food systems regulation rollbacks that are mostly involved with food safety, all right, that aren't on this list. And you can see what categories they're in. Air pollution and emissions are 24, that's the plurality. Drilling and extraction, those are also energy and climate related. And so those two together are about half of the total. But there are some that, 10 of these are biodiversity, some of them are water pollution, and so on. And so I have this long sort of list. I have the full list here on the next several slides. And I don't expect you to read this, but you can sort of look at it. I've highlighted in red the ones that actually matter quantitatively for the Nexus problem. And so I just was going to highlight those for you, even though this is like really sort of a boring list. But it's also something that's, I think, relevant for our citizenship now. So this number 2 is revised and repealed the Obama-era rule limiting methane emissions on public lands, including international venting and flaring, drilling operations, Interior Department. Why is that important? It's because natural gas is almost entirely methane. And it's 120 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2. Natural gas, if you burn it in a power plant, has half the emissions for the same amount of electricity relative to coal, so there's big greenhouse benefits. But if it gets into the atmosphere before it's burned, it's 120 times more potent pound for pound than CO2. And so that means if 1% of it gets into the atmosphere, it doubles its greenhouse impact. So you got to keep the system really tight, and the system has not been tight. So a project we organized here measured the emissions from all these operations in the United States, all different parts of the United States, and about 2% is leaking out of oil and gas operations before it gets to market. And so that's tripling the greenhouse impact of natural gas, right? And so we all worked hard to make sure there were regulations to roll that back. Now, I should say that the 10 largest oil and gas companies in the world drank that Kool-Aid and have voluntarily agreed to reduce the emissions. Remember, I said they were 2% in the US, 3% globally. Have voluntarily agreed to drop them back to 0.2%, which would make those emissions negligible. And this is a worldwide drawback. So it's 40% of the gas production in the world are covered by these companies. We've also raised the money for a private satellite who can sense all the methane leaks from these operations worldwide, and that will go online so that it's impossible to hide. And when we're all done, we'll get this done anyway. But my point is that the private enterprise, the people who sell this stuff, are doing this unilaterally anyway, all right? And so, although this emission is targeting something that is important, even though it seems obscure, most of the methane that leaks out during these, venting and flaring and all that sort of stuff that is talked about in here. And this is only on public lands, but a lot of the drilling and stuff is on public lands. So there's another one here, which is proposed rules to end federal requirements of oil and gas companies install technology to inspect for methane leaks. So they don't want to know how big the methane leaks are. proposed weakening Obama-era fuel economy standards for light cars and trucks. This is the real big one on the climate action plan. This is most of the reductions under the Obama-era stuff is in the cars and light trucks. They've been trying to reduce the Obama-era standard on mileage for cars and trucks from 55 miles per gallon by, I think, 2025 to 37 or something, which is where they already are. California did something else. They're now suing California. Some of the car companies said we're going to do what California did anyway, and the Trump administration is now engaged in an antitrust action against those companies because they've sided, because this is somehow an antitrust action to have sided with California. Okay, so that's what that one's all about. Announced a plan to withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement, which they've now filed the paperwork for. Proposed a repeal of the Clean Power Plan, which is which is in the courts right now. Proposed eliminating the Obama-era restrictions on that require new coal plants to capture their carbon dioxide emissions. That's because the coal plants wouldn't otherwise be competitive if you left the rest of these things in place. Proposed eliminating Obama-era restrictions, I already said that one. Proposed legal restriction for weakening Obama-era rule that limited mercury emissions from coal power plants. In coal power plants, coal contains a certain amount of mercury. Mercury leads to mental decreases in intelligence, at least as measured by testing and school performance in kids. And so mercury at the levels that was downwind of coal plants actually harms babies, okay? And so they wanted to take those regulations off. What else? Proposed revisions to standards from new and reconstructed power plants. That is, that's more clean power plant stuff. Relaxing Obama requirements that companies monitor and repair methane leaks at oil and gas facilities. That's this methane thing again. So you see, all of these are aimed at the primary CO2 regulations, which are in the Clean Power Plan and the Climate Action Plan, aimed primarily at CO2. That's where you were going to get the gigaton and a half reductions in CO2 by 2030. And the rest of them are aimed at methane, which is the other big story inside the United States for a greenhouse impact. Okay, so these are all sort of, the red ones are all targeting those. And finally, there's one at the bottom here. Proposed limiting the ability of individuals and communities to challenge EPA-issued pollution permits before panels of agency judges. So it used to be possible if they were going to put some sort of polluting facility in your community to challenge it, they made it impossible to challenge. All right. And then there's a bunch more. I've got one. This is one of the first wildlife ones. Revoke a directive for federal agencies to minimize impacts of wildlife on wildlife, water, and land. And other natural sources when approving development projects. In other words, you're no longer able to consider these things when you're approving development projects. That's what that's about. Change the way the Endangered Species Act is applied, making it more difficult to protect wildlife from long-term threats. This is water pollution, an important water pollution one. Prevented a rule that prevented coal companies from dumping mining debris into streams. And these are all toxic discharge into waterways. So this is a water problem. And then some sneaky ones. Proposed changes to the way cost-benefit analyses are conducted in the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and other environmental statutes. That's increasing the discount rate to 7%. That's what that's all about, okay? That's why we had to learn about the discount rate, okay? That's what that's all about. And so these are highly targeted to get at the heart of the regulations that had been in place to reduce the impact of nexus problems and to reverse them. So that although they look like they're just this, arcane stuff, they're actually extremely well targeted to get at the maximum possible rollback of regulations that have limited the impact of the nexus problems. And so, but the situation has changed fundamentally, and you can sense it if you wander around in Washington. If you talk to the administration appointees, there's not so much of that. There's just a lot of hostility and that sort of thing. But if you go to Congress and talk to Republicans, there's a completely different atmosphere. And it's somewhere between terror and an attempt to find a way to cooperate. And the question is what's caused it. This slide is actually one that the guy that formulated the Climate Action Plan and the Clean Power Plan for the Obama administration put together. And this is his explanation for why it's changed all of a sudden. First is that there has been subnational leadership. So many states and cities and companies are taking unilateral action, okay? The second is that US polling, as we've seen, just changed. So the issue polls differently than it did all of a sudden. So it means there could be a political cost. And then there's the Greta Thunberg and the Green New Deal, sort of the young people awakened. And this is a harbinger for trouble. And so there's radically more attention to climate than ever before. And we're going to talk about each one of these things, all right? So there are all kinds of state actions. This is a map of a thing called the US Climate Alliance. It's a group of states that have agreed to reduce their emissions at least 26 to 28% by 2025. But these states increasingly have many more restrictive laws than that. There's a thing called SB 100 in California that requires that its electrical system have 0 emissions by 2045. New York State just passed something similar. There are states all over the country that are doing this routinely, basically passing, and some now starting to pass net zero laws. Now these are under attack, and it's not clear if the feds are going to somehow try to stop the states from doing this. But there increasingly, there is state action now to do this. You'll see Virginia slip into with a change in the leadership in the last election. Virginia now has Dems in control of both state houses and the governorship. And what you'll see a net zero law in Virginia like this year, okay? And this just happens, these things just domino out. So in addition, there are cities in states that aren't in these alliances. All kinds of cities do this already. So most of the US is going to be covered by agreements that are subnational, but with active attempts to roll that back. So that's one set of actions that has had some substantial impact. A bunch of these states have tried to join carbon markets that are international, and the Trump administration is now suing them so that they won't be able to do that. All right, so for instance, California is in a carbon market that includes Quebec, and the claim is that that's a state engaging in an international treaty. All right, and so there's legal arcana about whether or not that's going to go. At the same time, what we've seen is a proliferation of carbon tax bills that have been submitted to the both branches of Congress. And I don't want to make too much about this, but there are a whole bunch of these things, and most of them have bipartisan sponsorship of some kind. And they'll have names like the American Opportunity Carbon-Free Act, or the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, all right? And so so there's a view that a carbon tax, particularly among conservative economists, is the best way to go here. And there are a lot of these laws that are now circulating, and they all have different numbers in them. This one's $52 a ton in 2020 and so on, but all of them start at a level that's, well, the lowest one here is 10, but it goes up by $10 a ton annually, all right? So it goes up fast. They all climb into the territory where, according to economics models and current technology, you would get net zero from each one of these acts. And what's interesting, the fact that these acts have all been submitted almost, even though a lot of them are bipartisan, wouldn't be that interesting. What's interesting is how these ideas poll nationally, and that's what's really changed. So instead of asking people, do you believe in global warming is caused by humans, that sort of thing, if instead you ask them something different, if you say, do you support this plan? And the plan in this case is the carbon dividends plan, which says we're going to issue a carbon tax that's pretty big, enough to drive the economy to net zero. And every year we're going to get all that carbon money and distribute it back to people. Government's going to write you a check, okay? And the check is going to be the same for every person in the country. So that if you're a big carbon user, then you pay a lot of tax, but you get back then a smaller number. If you're a small carbon user, you get back a bigger number. You make a profit, right? You see that? And so if you ask, how does that, and this would actually solve the problem, right? If the tax was big enough. And the tax and the ones that are there is pretty big. So the support in total in GOP people is 53% already for that. So more than half of self-identified Republicans support it. 64% of swing state members, 80% of Dems, okay? And 75% of GOP people less than 40. Now, these numbers are shocking for politicians, right? Something like this is so popular. And the numbers are actually bigger than those who would identify carbon and climate as an issue that requires strong action right now, much stronger. So when you don't have to admit that, you just say, do you want this particular plan? They say, oh yeah, we want this plan, right? So that's interesting, right? And that also makes politicians think, kind of, the game is up. We need a new game. And then, of course, the young begin to stir. We have a Green New Deal. The Sunrise Movement, I don't know if you know what the Sunrise Movement is, but it's sort of the brain trust behind the Green New Deal. Greta Thunberg here, who is sort of an international pop cultural phenomenon, right? It's really interesting that humanity throws off people like that. And then there's this group, Extinction Rebellion, at the other fringe. Who's heard of Extinction Rebellion? Who's heard of them? Okay, good. So Extinction Rebellion, if you're a climate activist, Extinction Rebellion makes you look like pikers. In fact, I got to be in London on Monday and Tuesday, so I won't be at Monday's lecture. I'll be on Wednesday's lecture. And going to London now is like a complete crapshoot because Extinction Rebellion, there's a high probability that a building I have to go into will be inaccessible because some Extinction Rebellion person has superglued his or her butt to their front door. I'm not kidding, okay? It's amazing. Okay? Those people are committed, okay? Yep. This is actually what Extinction Rebellion wants, all right? Extinction Rebellion only has 3 demands. The first one is that government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency and working with others to communicate the urgency for change. That's good. Number 2, government must act now to halt biodiversity and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025, okay? So we're gonna completely shut down our fossil energy system by 2025. Get ready for it. And 3rd, government must create and be led by decisions of a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice. So this is a statement that, no, we're going to have a group focused on climate and ecological justice that is going to tell the government legally what to do, okay? So this is a radical organization, right? You got to understand, I mean, by sort of any definition of the word, this is a radical organization, and yet, It
succeeded in 3. They announced the UK is going to have a citizens' assembly.
Yeah, but there's a difference between announcing a citizens' assembly and announcing a citizens' assembly whose actions you actually have to follow. Okay, so that's the difference. That is the difference. Okay, say sure you can have a citizens' assembly. Okay, that's one thing, right? So Extinction Rebellion amazes me, and Extinction Rebellion is really different than the Green New Deal. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Green New Deal. This is a summary about the Green New Deal. If you talk to people sort of out there in the public about what the Green New Deal wants, they'll say something that sounds a lot like what Extinction Rebellion wants. But if you read the Green New Deal, I can't find most of that stuff in it. Certainly the energy and climate stuff. Turns out that Ocasio-Cortez's office had on her website a net zero by 2030 rule when they first announced this, but wasn't part of the Green New Deal, had been negotiated away. That was like an error, and it was removed like within a day. but it's stuck as a meme within people's minds. Did anybody who read the Green New Deal, it was on the list of reading for the day, did anybody actually see anything about the timing for the Green? Yeah, it's not in there at all. There is no, the only thing they say is that we have to plan for net zero in the first 10 years. So we have to have a plan over the first 10 years. Doesn't say how long it's going to take. Later in the course, we're going to go through the technological changes that would be roughly cost competitive with what we pay today. And the answer is if you do it over 30 years, it's about cost competitive with what we pay today. And that's simply because our energy infrastructure, our capital, turns over on a 30-year time scale anyway. So when it wears out, you build this instead of that, right? So on a 30-year time scale, my contention is you can drive it to net zero cost effectively. If you try to do it by 2025, that would cost a lot. Okay, so anyway, there's none of that in the Green New Deal, but there is this one little paragraph. Did you find this? It's a subsection H. It's kind of 2/3 of the way through the document. And it says guaranteeing a job with a family-sustaining wage. So that's a guaranteed personal income. Adequate family and medical leave. Down here it says a little bit more about that. So that's universal health care. Paid vacations, retirement security to the people of the United States. So we already provide, arguably. So this is interesting. So there's this set of social programs that are stated as goals that are like buzzwords for Elizabeth Warren's agenda, right? Well, not even quite Elizabeth Warren's agenda. I don't think she's for a universal guaranteed income. So anyway, that's stuck in here. And so the question I have for you is it a good idea or not to include these social objectives in something like the Green New Deal? And I can see arguments on both sides. And what I'd like you to do first is to actually talk to your neighbors about this a little bit. So let's spend a couple of minutes blabbing about it, okay? A good idea or a bad idea, okay? And what about the list of environmental objectives? Are they adequate or not adequate when you read the Green New Deal itself, all right?
It's non-binding, but it still seems like a big step towards it. No, it's not really?
I think it's stalling. Okay. They want them to stop disrupting traffic.
It's just a solve.
Blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
So you don't think there'll be any political pressure on them to adopt whatever citizens said they don't?
No. I think the Green Party might push a little bit, but no, I mean they're preoccupied by Brexit. Yeah, I think so. Okay, people, why don't we now vote on the first one here? Is it a good idea to include the social objectives, to bundle those social objectives with the environmental objective? The environmental objective to get to net zero on some schedule. I'm going to argue that 30 years is consistent with what's in the deal. And 30 years, there's not much difference in cost between doing this in 30 and doing it in 40 and doing it in 50. Doing it in 20 is a lot more expensive than doing it in 30, turns out. Okay? Okay, I'm going to kill it. And so yes and no are almost even, well, not evenly split. It's 58% to 39%. So can somebody who wants to argue, let's start with no, all right? It's a bad idea. Let's start with that. Does somebody want to argue? Whoops. Somebody want to raise your hand and defend that point of view? Don't be shy. Here's somebody. Do we have a mic? Here. Oh.
Yeah, it might just be bad on a strategic level because you do what you might, or you might not get a lot of support from the right, and you put a lot of these progressive social things into it.
Yeah. So if you if you look at the venerable and now seeming increasingly hoary-seeming, hoary and H-O-A-R-Y seeming environmental NGOs like Environmental Defense Fund, where I'm a trustee, their worry is that if you do this, you might gain a few on the left, but you lose the 10 you need on the right to get something through Congress, right? So that's the pragmatic political argument. Anybody on the plus side? There's somebody back there.
So in my precept, we talked about the Pope's work, Laudato Si, where he said that we had to look at the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and one without, and doing one at the expense of the other would be a problem for a lot of people.
Yeah, so you'd lose support on the left then if you carved these things apart?
Not just that, but it's the idea that, as the Pope said in Laudato Si that we talked about in my precept, we have to look out for both the environment and the disadvantaged.
Yeah,
and how looking out for only one might be it could be a problem. Like, stuff with the environment could shrink the GDP, so if it wasn't done right, it could hurt people's well-being and hurt in other ways, and that's what we talked about in precept.
So the question is, so there are two possibilities here. One is that if you believe that you are morally obligated to do both of these things, it's a pragmatic issue on the one hand about whether or not it's best to try to do them separately or together. And that's just which is most likely to work, right? But there's a secondary problem in that, for instance, solving the climate problem, you could do it in such a way that was inconsistent with the well-being of everybody in the country. So I'll give you a good example. We're going to talk about this later, but the cheapest system we could build in the United States right now was primarily wind and solar. But it would have what amounted to emergency generators running on natural gas to back up that system during the extremely rare periods, once every few years, where on continental scales the wind doesn't blow enough or the sun and it's cloudy, and where the whole system would go down catastrophically. And if you were trying to back that up with a 100% renewable system, it costs a fortune because you need to buy Tesla batteries for the entire country that would last for 3 weeks, right? It's unbelievably expensive. But if you just have a few backup generators that vent to the atmosphere, it's really cheap to do. On the other hand, where are those backup generators going to be located? Historically, they'd be located closest to the sources of the power draw, and those are where all kinds of people live in the middle of cities, and they're disproportionately poor, and they're the ones that are going to get the occasional air pollution, right? Because these would just be straight turbines. And so there's an environmental justice issue that goes along with this. Well, I think we should move on. What about the list of environmental objectives? Is it adequate or inadequate in that plan from your reading? Like, should it be closer to what the Extinction Rebellion has, or is it, or not? Or inadequate in some other way, I suppose. It could go in either side. Okay, I'm going to kill it. And about the same, adequate and inadequate. Somebody who believes inadequate, could you tell us why? I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I'd be curious. On what side is it inadequate? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so this is good. So you want something closer to what Extinction Rebellion has, in the direction of a stronger challenge to the sort of consumer-driven culture and capitalism to begin with, and that somehow you have to challenge capitalism to get the job done. Right. All right. Okay. I want to move on here. There's also this Green Real Deal that I had you read, and this is a guy named Matt Gaetz, who's a Florida congressman. He's a strong Trump supporter, but he lives in a state where public opinion has strongly shifted in the direction of believing climate change because, they keep getting sunny day flooding. primarily, right? And that the whole state now is facing a collapse in property values as the seas rise, right? So he says publicly, you know, it is just stupid to deny climate change. And so his Green Real Deal has 4 main programs. First, fewer government regulations, specifically removing regulations borrowing federal lands from being used for renewable energy research, okay? Modernizing the electric grid, and that means that's a very sensible thing to do, right? So that's an ability to move, for instance, sunshine power from the American Southwest to New England in the wintertime. And so that requires a high voltage DC network that would require federal investment to do. Technologies like nuclear energy, hydropower, and carbon capture, and better protecting the intellectual property of American clean energy innovators. And that's really code words for keeping the Chinese from stealing the stuff that we invent in this space. So you guys had a chance to read this, and I want to jump on ahead, so why don't we just vote on that one? Yes or no? Is this list of, is this sort of a good list to get started with? It's a good place to start. If in fact that's the only deal you can cut, say. All right. So it's 50-50, all right? So that's interesting, right? So some of you want to say, look, you take what deal you can right now, you get that going, and others say, no, this isn't going to do the job. It's true that what he's proposing isn't going to cut emissions very much. But some of the things are very helpful, like especially the HVDC grid. That's a really good idea, all right? That's really important. And it might even be enough, as we'll see, to tip the technological balance so that the thing runs on its own, right? But okay, good. All right, what am I doing here? There we go. So we saw earlier that many Democrats are leaning now very strongly towards making this a highbrow issue. And I have a table in the slides here that shows the position of every Democratic candidate for the presidency, not including Michael Bloomberg, who is supposedly just announcing today, and still including Beto O'Rourke, who quit already. Okay, so this is a fluid situation. You can read this at your leisure. It's impossible essentially to read on the screen here. I bet you can read it on your screen. But what it says is, what's interesting is that every one of these has a net zero greenhouse gas emitting system in the platform in either 2045 or 2050, okay? Something considerably stronger than the long-term goal of the Obama era system. So a net zero energy system by 2050 or 2045 in every single one of these plans. So you can be sure that that's going to survive into the Democratic platform. And that goal, net zero by 2045 or 2050, has been adopted now by several states, as I've said. It is the current flavor of the month for countries. When countries re-up and want to make a strong statement under the Paris Agreement, this is the goal they have. Last year, this was barely on the radar screen. 2 years ago in this course, wasn't on it at all. So all of a sudden, the sort of zeitgeist has shifted to the view that we can now not just start to solve this problem, we can end it in about 30 years' time. And 30 years seems like a long time to you now, but when you get there, it won't, okay? So 30 years, I like to say 31 point something is a billion seconds, and they go by really fast, all right? All right, so you can take a look at that. I want to do a quick preview of the technological endgame, and I'm just going to motor mouth through this because I'm going to talk a lot about the technological endgame later. The technological mix that we have now in the last 15 years consists of wind and solar, still some nuclear and hydro. These are just the options that are available that are cost competitive in the sense that they cost as much as things that are already used at scale in the energy system. Natural gas with carbon capture and storage, emergency power from offset natural gas, that is, turbines that are used once in a while, like when the wind doesn't blow every 3 years, that you offset by growing a forest or something. Heat from electricity and heat from electricity, that is industrial heat. Heat in houses from electricity. Heat pumps, there's a thing you can buy called a heat pump. And hydrogen from electrolysis or natural gas with carbon capture and storage. Hydrogen is a big deal because you need to have something you can burn in a furnace to make a really hot heat for industry. And it's really expensive to do it with electricity. So you need something you can burn, and if you burn a hydrocarbon, the CO2 comes up the stack. And you can either capture that, or you could make hydrogen and burn that, and that only makes water vapor, right? You just oxidize water. So electric heat, light, and cooling, an almost all electric system with electric cars and trucks. So this is the system now we're going to talk about that is cost competitive, and there are many different flavors of this. It could be almost all renewables, or almost all nuclear and gas with CCS, right? Depending on what you want to do. Now, to make this happen, a US believer in the power of markets would put a price on carbon that rises through time, okay? And a believer in command and control would subsidize these technologies, pick winners, and then try to advance them that way, all right? So command and control says, I'm going to pick the winners and subsidize them. And a believer in the markets would say, now just put a price on carbon and let the market sort it out. In the Obama era, they actually didn't put a price on carbon. They subsidized wind, solar, and electric cars. There was no CCS subsidy, no nuclear subsidy, but they subsidized these critical technologies. And as we'll see, wind and solar are 80% of the problem in the lowest cost system already, all right? So that's what he did. And then what did the Republicans do? You saw all the things they repealed, all these different things. And then what did they do? Well, in December of 2017, stuck in the tax bill, they stuck a subsidy in. And then there was this weird thing called the Freedom Act in February of the next year, and they stuck subsidies in there. And what were those subsidies? They kept the Obama-era solar and wind and electric car subsidies the same. And they added a big price on capturing carbon in industrial sources and storing it underground. 3 times the size of Europe's current price on carbon. This was an all-Republican bill, and it didn't make the news. And it's the law of the land right now. You can collect this. Companies all over the place are working on this. So they basically subsidized most of this system, and in a way that the Obama team never was able to do. So these are all really the elements you would need for a technological endgame. Now, I don't know why that so that's interesting. So why did this happen? And my argument is that it's the wisdom of the marketplace, concluding that we've passed a technological tipping point, and the wisdom of the marketplace expressing itself through lobbying. I actually did some forensic work on this and said, how did that happen? And there were a bunch of co-sponsors, including this oil and gas guy, Barrasso, and Senator Heitkamp, who's a Dem but is from North Dakota, where they have lots of fossil. So these were fossil people. And then White House, who's like the biggest greenie in the Senate. And they co-sponsored this thing. Rob Portman from Ohio did it also because these are all oil and gas people, right? Co-sponsor in Texas was this oil and gas guy. And Rob Portman, because his state builds wind turbine components. And so there were also, all the car companies were for the electrification part. So in other words, all different parts of the marketplace said, holy smokes, technology has changed. This thing is going to happen. We've got to be on the right side of the market. So I want to subsidize my part of it. And they all lobbied independently. And this thing just emerged from the bottom up. That's what I mean by the wisdom of the market. I've run out of time. We will have another divestment discussion later in the course, okay?